Hi, and welcome to the mental health series, The Struggle is Real, with the Howard University School of Social Work. My name is Jalen Williams, and I am your presenter for today. I will be presenting on the topic Empower Her Rethinking Mental Health for Black Women. I want to, before I begin, just thank blackdoctor.org for allowing us to use your audience, your followership as well to spread the knowledge of this presentation today. I also want to thank Howard University School of Social Work as well as Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration for this collaboration. Next slide, please. So before we begin, I just want to take a minute to introduce myself. As I said, my name is Jalen Williams. I'm a licensed clinical social worker, licensed in DC, Maryland, and Virginia. I'm a board approved supervisor in the state of Maryland. I have a bachelor's of social work from Methodist University, located in Fayetteville, North Carolina, and I have a master's of social work from Howard University, located in Washington, DC. I'm currently a second year doctoral student at Barry University, working towards my doctorate of social work and trauma-informed leadership and practice. I hold a certificate in the assessment and treatment of trauma in children and adolescents from the University of Maryland as well. From my professional experience, I have experience working with families, children, and individuals in various settings to include schools, government, as well as private practice. I currently work part-time in private practice at Better Generations, which is a private practice located in Washington, D.C. I primarily work with Black women and men and couples. I've been in private practice since 2019. I also am a clinical supervisor for the Department of Defense Family Advocacy Program. We work with the identification, assessment, intervention, and treatment with domestic and partner violence, child abuse and neglect, and problematic sexual behaviors with children and youth. So that's little bit about me. But before we start, I did want to give a trigger warning and encourage self care. We can go to the next slide. So, today we'll be talking about various different topics to include intergenerational and historical trauma. We'll also be talking about mental health diagnosis such as depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation, as well as suicide. We'll be going over some stats as well that pertain to Black women. So, I just wanted to give a trigger warning for you all to let you know that that is what we'll be discussing. So, I'm also encouraging to practice self care as well throughout this presentation. If you find yourself becoming dysregulated, please just take time to yourself, look out the window, maybe get in contact with your care provider, take some deep breaths, step away. We'll be here when you get back. I also want to go ahead and let you all know that when I share stats, I just want you all to be mindful that it's just stats pertaining to Black women. That doesn't mean it's the sum of your story. It's not the entirety of your story. Maybe it resonates with you or somebody you know, and that's okay. I just want to be mindful that it's not the entirety of your story. I also want to let you all know this is an interactive presentation. So if you're interacting in the chat, um, please do so freely. It's not mandatory. There's no pressure to, but just be mindful to be respectful. You don't have to share if you don't want to. And I'll be asking for different times throughout the presentation for you to interact in the chat as well. Next slide, please. So to keep me on course today and to kind of go over what we're going to be covering, the first objective we have is we're going to gain an in-depth understanding of specific cultural, social, and systematic factors that contribute to health challenges experienced by Black women. And then we're going to examine the historical and societal context that contributes to mental health disparities specific to Black women. And then we're going to explore culturally competent therapeutic approaches, interventions, and self care strategies that address the unique experiences of Black women. And then lastly, we're going to learn about and identify resources and organizations that support and advocate the unique experiences of Black women and their mental health. I know you all tuning in today may not be clinicians, you may not be working in mental health field, but there are going to be some practical things that you can take away, some things maybe that you want to research and look up and save for later. So I just want you to be mindful of that. I'm going to try to reach everybody. Next slide, please. So chat time. I know I talked about utilizing the chat. So one couple of things I want you all to think about is, what is a strong Black woman? Are you a strong Black woman? And it's okay if you're not a Black woman. Maybe you're a Hispanic female, a white female. Maybe you're a male tuning in. That's totally okay. maybe you don't identify as a strong Black woman, but I want you to take a second to think about the strong Black woman that you may know in your life. And is it you? And while you all take a minute to think about that, I'm going to give you all some context. When I asked the Black woman in my life, what is a strong Black woman? So when I asked the people in my life what a strong Black woman was, they gave me characteristics of resilience, perseverance, formidable, um, formidable and confident, self aware. I also got some negative characteristics as well, such as they lack the ability to take care of themselves. They lack the ability to they lack the ability to take care of themselves, and they lack the ability to prioritize their self-care. When I asked people, are you a strong Black woman? They said, yes, I have to be. I'm an independent woman. I'm single. I have to be in order to survive. My strength is what makes me get through the day. And then I also had some responses that said, no, of course, I'm not a strong Black woman. I don't subscribe to that. I don't have time for it. And then I also asked people, do you know a strong Black woman in your life? And the responses I got back were from an array of different people, were the females in my life. So mothers, grandmothers, aunties, cousins. I also got the response of, I am the strong Black woman in my life. So as we go out through this presentation, I kind of want you to hold on to some of the things that we mentioned as I go through the different characteristics. And as we go through the presentation, just hold on to these little gems and think about these people as we go through it, because it's easier to connect information when you can connect it to a story or a person you know. Next slide, please. All right, so you all took the time to identify on your own, and I shared some responses that I got about what the strong Black woman is. And so here in literature, we call it the strong Black woman role. You may see it as superwoman syndrome or strong Black woman schema. The strong Black woman role is a race gender schema that prescribes culturally specific feminine expectations for African American women. And so when we're talking about a race gendered schema, I'm going to kind of do some reframing because I know this is really technical terminology. So when we say schema, just think of schema as behavior patterns and thought patterns. So we can also interchange the word schema with lens. It's a lens that Black women interpret the environment and their world through. It informs the world around them. And so I want you to think for a minute, like, well, how does one, become a strong Black woman? Like, did we sign up for this? I know I didn't raise my hand and sign up for it. So how did we get to be strong Black women? Next slide, please. All right, so let's talk about the history of a strong Black woman. If you answered no, I didn't sign up for this, or maybe it's just something that you were taught growing up, we're going to go over the history of a strong Black woman. So, the strong Black woman is actually a role that developed during colonialism and slavery as a survival mechanism for Black women. If we think back through what Black people experienced during slavery in America or colonialism anywhere else in the world, there was a lot of violence. And so it was developed to help us take care of ourselves and to take care of our communities and be resilient. And so the literature, think back to some of the characteristics that you may just described on the previous slide. The characteristics that are defined in the literature is unyielding strength, perseverance, self-reliance. We have caregiving. We also have caregiving, and we have self-preservation. We have self-assurance, we have isolation. Those are the characteristics that the literature describes that relate with the strong Black woman role. So we have all these characteristics, and it's there to, protect us during these times of slavery. Well, you may ask yourself, what does it have to do with me now, modern day? Well, modern day Black woman, there are protective factors in place that the strong Black woman aid. And those protective factors can be negative stereotypes, racism, and sexism. Think back to when we reviewed what the literature defined the strong Black woman as. And that was a race gender schema, thought patterns, and processes. So when we talk about protective factors, the literature defines protective factors for Black women as racism, sexism, but then we think about stereotypes. Well, what type of stereotypes do Black women face today? Maybe you're from down south, maybe you're from a more conservative space. in the United States. So think about the hypersexual Jezebel. That's a stereotype that Black women have. Maybe you're from Europe and it's the mammy, it's the nurturing mammy, or maybe it's the welfare queen. If maybe you're in a metropolitan area, and I think this last one a lot of you all can relate to is the domineering sapphire. Well, what is that? That's known as the angry Black woman. So these are some negative stereotypes that the strong Black woman role helps mitigate against. And I added this quote here: "We must embrace pain, then burn it as fuel for journey," from Kenji Mizawa. I actually got out of a book from Marita Golden, The Strong Black Woman: How a Myth Affects the Mental and Physical Health of a Black Woman. You can get it from Amazon. And maybe you don't want such a clinical approach or such a research based approach. You just want real life stories. It's a great resource for you to utilize and have. And I thought this quote was perfect because it embraces everything we just talked about. We must embrace pain and burn it as fuel for the journey. The characteristics that maybe you listed out for yourself, or maybe the characteristics that you listed out that I listed out, it encompasses that self-reliance, the perseverance, the isolation, the success, the resilience, the strength, and caregiving. One thing I want to kind of focus on right now and highlight is that for the characters of the strong Black woman role, research shows that there is an emphasis on caregiving and unyielding strength. So as we go through this presentation, I want you to kind of keep that in the back of your mind as we continue to talk. Next slide, please. All right, so we talked about the strong Black woman role being a race, gender, schema thought pattern, but there's actually terminology that we use for it in mental health when we're working with Black women, or just in any human services or social services agency, right? It's called gendered racism. And gendered racism represents the intersection, right? Two things are crossing, and that would be race and sex for Black women. And for Black women, it's more than just the intersection of race and sex. It's how the two intertwine. It's the intermesh of the different forms of oppression that occur due to this intersection. And you may, once again, you may be thinking, well, like, how does this affect me? It's more than, like I said, just the race and gender, the intersection of it is the intermesh. It's the synergy. It's how race and sex affect Black women. And today in the modern world, it affects Black women because we have higher mortality rates, higher rates of infant mortality, cardiovascular disease, hypertension, obesity, anxiety. It affects our job hiring processes. It also affects our depressive symptoms. Psychological distress can be experienced, suicidal ideation, and sexual reproductive health. So keep all these things in the back pocket as we continue out. We're kind of building here in this moment. And we've talked about the strong Black woman role is a schema. It's how the Black woman interprets the world, it's the thought patterns and behaviors. We know it started in colonialism. It was born out of slavery. It was a survival mechanism. And we know that there is an intersection, or it is an intermesh of different experiences that cause Black women to have some negative or adverse experiences. So moving on to the next slide, I'm going to go ahead and take this time to identify some biological and historical factors. I'm sorry, next slide. All right. So historical and biological contributors. This is kind of like my favorite part of this presentation. So you may be thinking, well, how do historical and biological contributors affect Black women today? The first thing I'm going to start out with is historical. If you all are familiar with post-traumatic stress disorder, right? That is a stress disorder that people experience when they experience some type of trauma. And the interesting and cool thing about PTSD is that you don't actually have to be at that event for you to experience the symptoms. So hyperarousal or flashbacks or anything of that nature. You can just hear it through, a storytelling. You can watch it on TV. Maybe modern day you're watching something on Instagram, right? There are a lot of things that we have access to nowadays. And so post-traumatic slave syndrome refers to the adaptive and survival behaviors that are congruent with the long-term effects of slavery present in the modern Black experience. Okay, so let's take a moment to kind of think about this. We know the strong Black woman schema was a survival mechanism and behavior, and it was adapted during slavery, right? Post-traumatic slave syndrome is adaptive behavior, and Dr. Joy DeGruy has a really great books on it and research on it that talks about how post-traumatic slave syndrome affects Black women today. So when we think about it, in slavery. We went through trauma, we were oppressed, there was violence, there was rape, there were different things that we experienced. And not only did we experience as Black women, we watched Black men and Black children go through it as well. And then we were freed, and then the oppression continued through segregation and policy. And we were just continuing to be, thrown into these situations where we were never getting the healing that we needed. Okay. And then move forward past segregation, we're free. There's equal, there's supposed to be equal for all of us, right? But we never got that healing from that past trauma. Now, when we think about post-traumatic slave syndrome, Dr. Joy DeGruy gives a great example of a white mom and a Black mom. Modern day, the Black mom and the white mom are talking about their two sons. And when they're talking about their two sons, the Black mom is praising the white mom, like, oh, your son is succeeding. He's doing great. He did this, he did that. And the white mom was like, well, no, actually, your son is doing better than mine. He has this, he has that. And the Black mom says, well, no, like, like he's really a handful at home. So let's take that lens. Remember, we talked about schema and behaviors. Let's take that and apply that back to slavery. We have a white slave master and a slave, and the white slave master begins to praise the slave's son or child. And in order to protect him, she begins to denigrate, like, oh no, denigrate him. So it's, oh no, he's this, he's that, he's not good at that. You don't want him. He's not smart. He's not all there. He or she. Well, now today, because of historical trauma and contributors that we have, it now shows up in our modern time. We do it out of self-preservation. We do these things to save not only ourselves but our community and to prevent further violence. And so Jalen Agnew has a great TED talk that says, Black people, there is trauma in your traditions. And I will touch on that a little bit later when we talk about cultural factors. But when we talk about historical trauma, post-traumatic slave syndrome, and these adaptive behavior, because it was necessary in survival, it's been passed down. And when it's passed down generation to generation, it begins to become socialized, and then it becomes to become normalized. Some examples of this is like when you walk into the store, don't touch nothing. I know for me, living down south, don't walk outside without no earrings on, and you don't go out here and embarrass me looking crazy. You say yes ma'am and no ma'am. These are things that we did to protect ourselves. Moving on from historical contributors, we have biological, and maybe this may be a little mind-blowing to you, but yes, trauma can be passed down through your genes. Mind-blowing. I was like crazy new when I found that out. So inter and transgenerational trauma. When we talk about intergenerational trauma, think of inside. It's happening inside of me. And the way trauma works through researchers have been able to use different populations to really identify whether trauma is being passed down through cortisol in genes, through saliva. And so they found out that it does. And what it does is that the transmission of trauma actually changes the way your DNA is modified or read, which means that it changes the overall functioning. So think of this way. You have a reader in your body that reads DNA. It is supposed to read A, B, C, but because of intergenerational trauma and the adaptive behaviors that we learn, it now reads D, E, F, which means that it's changing the overall functioning of your gene, which means that it's changing the way that you behave and respond to different things. So now we got the things happening inside of us, but now we have transgenerational trauma. Remember when I talked about Jalen Agnew, we talk about trauma being passed down from generation to generation. This is transgenerational trauma. This is the psychological and behavioral transfer of information across generations. So this is the examples I'm talking about. When you walk in the store, don't touch nothing. When you walk outside, you represent me. Children are to be seen, not heard. These are how this comes up. And remember, if you think back to a couple of slides, when I was talking about the strong Black woman schema, it's become a part of our socialization as Black women. It's actually a part of how we raise young Black girls. I think of the sentiment that we raise our daughters and love our sons. That's what comes to mind when I'm talking about this. So keep these things in your back pocket as we're talking about this. Maybe you were able to identify some things that popped up for you when I was talking about these slides, and just kind of relate that to there. Next slide, please. All right, next we have cultural contributors. The first big one, we have stigma. If you are a part of the Black community, we don't talk about mental health. we don't need to see somebody. What happens in the family stays in the family, right? And mental illness is associated with shame and embarrassment in the African American community. And now, yes, modern day, it has been something that we have brought to the forefront, and that's great. So when we talk about stigma, in the Black community, part of it is self concealment. And back in the day, we did it as a protective factor and to preserve how the Black family is viewed. And so when we self conceal what we're experiencing, or we self conceal our mental health disorders, or even our mental health well being, because you don't even have to have a disorder to have your mental well being affected, right? And so when we're talking about stigma, the the self-concealment then leads to negative thought processes like, oh well, I can kind of do this on my own, I don't need no help from nobody. That's how that translates. Then we talk about access to culturally competent care. This is really important because Black women oftentimes are reluctant to seek care because, one, does my provider look like me? Two, will they even understand, the colloquialism and you language that I use, and do you understand my experience? So research shows, specifically Just Come Woods shows in her research, that a provider may not understand the complexities or social context of a Black woman's life, leading to Black women maybe not feeling that their provider is as compassionate or understanding. And you don't have to be a Black provider to provide access to culturally complex care. You just have to understand the Black experience and understand that the Black experience is a diaspora. There is not just one single Black experience. There's different cultures and ethnicities within that. So that's something you understand. The next thing we have as cultural contributors is spirituality and religion. We just gonna pray about it. We don't need to talk about it. We're gonna give it to God, and that's what we're gonna do. And so research shows that utilizing religion and spirituality to counter negative effects of stressful circumstances. Black women are more likely to go to church and leave it at the altar because God's not gonna put more on me than I can bear. And go through emotional distress in a church setting where it is more acceptable. And that's great. That's a sense of community that we have there. But it can also contribute to some adverse experiences we have with our mental health. Now we have the strong Black woman role in help seeking behaviors. Remember, we identified some characteristics that go along with the strong Black woman role, right? Self-perseverance, resilience, independence, um, caregiving, strength. Well, when you have that schema or that lens, how you interpret life, you may mask or ignore pain and avoid the appearance of weakness or the inability to help self or care for yourself or care for others. This is really important. And one example I'm going to give you, how many of you all, or maybe it's you, you're like, you know what? I'm going to push through this. I don't got time to worry about XYZ emotion. I don't got time to worry about this. As long as I'm taking care of XYZ, I don't need to worry about this. So those are some things that can come up. Next, we have cultural trauma. Historical trauma experienced by Black women in the medical and helping profession specifically. One thing that comes to mind when we talk about cultural trauma with Black women, and when we talk about help seeking our medical and helping professions, is gynecology. Black women were experimented on, didn't were able to exercise autonomy. They were practiced on unethically to advance gynecology, and so this has left Black women a little hesitant to seek help from somebody. Especially when we talk about maybe some other health service agencies, maybe CPS. We don't need to call people because you may take my kids away or you may judge me. Those are some things that contribute to Black women's mental health. So we have cultural contributors, we have historical and biological. Next, we're going to go on to societal and economic. Next slide, please. All right, socioeconomic contributors. First things first, pay gaps and wealth gaps. As you all know, we've talked about strong Black woman role and the Black community, struggles that we have faced within the Black community as far as equal pay, and we don't come into the world with generational wealth. It's oftentimes something that we are building on our own. And so for Black women, when we were during segregation, when we were trying to move out of those jobs that we did in slavery, so agriculture or domestic work, I think of the movie The Help when I think of this. We were babysitting and taking care of white children. And so we weren't allowed to advance. And so There is a specific type of segregation that occurred after slavery, de jure and de facto. De jure segregation refers to Black people not having the ability to work due to work in trades, due to not having an expensive license. And so that was one way that they kept Black women in certain roles. And then we have de facto segregation, which was actual policy that said that Black women couldn't hold certain jobs or they couldn't do certain roles, even if they had the experience and the knowledge to do so. And so this pay gap and this wealth gap that we experience, I'll tie it into the environmental as well as student loan crisis. Um, how it affects Black women's mental health. When you think of how much we're getting paid, think about the type of jobs we may be working modern day. We don't get paid as much as our white counterparts, male or female. And so that may also affect our ability to access insurance as well. The student loan crisis is one that probably a lot of you all will relate to. Black women are thriving in academia. We have a high percentage for bachelor's degrees. We account for a high percentage of master's degrees. And we also, out of the 3% of people who have doctoral degrees, Black women account for 63% of them. The issue comes in though is when it comes to the amount of money that we're taking out. Think about to the pay gaps and wealth gaps I just talked about. We're not coming into multi-generational wealth. We're oftentimes sometimes first generation college students. And so this affects us because we're taking out more money than others. And then we're also not getting paid as much, which is contributing to the wealth gap that we experience. Also, when we talk about environmental factors, there is a specific type of segregation called redlining that occurs for black women. And so we tend to be segregated in certain areas, which affect our ability to access effective mental health and physical health medical services. Also, and when we talk about pay gaps and wealth gaps and tying that into environmental, Black women are more likely to be heads of households with more dependents. So we not only are we not getting paid as much, we're trying to, live the American dream and get the student loan, get the degrees that we need to succeed. And then we're trying to buy the home and and generate generational wealth. And it's affecting us adversely when it comes to our mental health. When we go back, I forgot to mention on one of the slides, when we're talking about just post-traumatic stress disorder, hyperarousal is one of them. And when we talk about hyperarousal as a PTSD symptom, one of the things that we experience is toxic stress. And we already mentioned cortisol and how that relates to trauma. Toxic stress produces cortisol, which means that we are really stressed out. And so when we add these different contributors in there, it's affecting our mental health. Um, and so one way when we talk about rethinking Black women's mental health, which we'll get to later, that's one thing I also want to keep you in mind of is reducing cortisol levels. Next slide, please. All right. So when we talk about cortisol levels being high, Black women's mental health, anxiety, eating disorders, post-traumatic stress disorder, and depression, they're all linked to increased levels of cortisol and norepinephrine. And those are two stress hormones that are released during your flight, fight, or freeze response. The other thing I want to point out is I believe in 2019, suicide was a leading cause of death amongst 16 to 24-year-old Black women. This is really important to note is that we are experiencing depression, anxiety, and eating disorders, post-traumatic stress disorders, and suicide at higher rates. The other interesting thing when we talk about depression, because of the strong Black woman role, we may not be diagnosed because our symptoms may not present how they may present for our white counterparts. It's not typical for us to experience low mood or complete loss of functioning. We're normally high functioning. It may generate as somatic symptoms, meaning that we're having headaches, maybe we're having tension in our chest or in our back, or maybe we're having stomach aches. So I know we just kind of talked about a lot in the last 30 minutes, and you're probably like, well, I'm all over the place. So I just want to take a minute, allow you to digest the information, maybe connect some things that I shared to some of the experiences you currently have, or maybe you have a friend, a friend's friend, your mom, your grandma, your cousin, whomever, an auntie, and connect some of the things I've talked about. But before we go on, I do just kind of want to take a moment. Next slide, please. to take a moment to just kind of center and ground ourselves. And we're rethinking Black women's mental health. And I just want to kind of shake out all that stuff we talked about because some feelings, even me presenting it, it's like feel kind of hopeless. Like, why is this stuff happening? Where is the sense of control there? Next slide, please. Next slide. While we're waiting for the next slide, I want you all to just kind of take a moment to breathe and center yourselves. I like to do a 6-5-6 exercise with my clients. So we're going to breathe in for 6, hold for 5, and then exhale for 6. And when you're exhaling, act like you're blowing out a candle for your birthday and kind of press your lips. And while you're doing those breathing exercises, maybe you're grounding yourself, maybe you're just taking a minute to look out the window or jotting down some things I'm talking about. When we talk about rethinking mental health for Black women, I want to give this impression of therapy isn't just one way. It's not going to look the same way for everybody. And so we're going to think outside the box when I go into some of the next things I'm going to talk about. And I understand everybody tuning in or watching this webinar back may not be a clinician, and that's okay. But you can take some of these techniques and use on your own. It's not a substitute for a mental health professional, but it is something that you can kind of put in your back pocket, and it is something that you can kind of look into because I'll give you some resources. So, two terms I want to introduce to you is integrative therapy. So, integrative therapy is basically when we take a whole lot of approaches. Maybe think of a gumbo for therapy. We take a whole lot of approaches and we put it in a pot and we work with the client. It's a holistic approach. It's a client-centered approach because therapy isn't always linear and it's not always going to look the same for everybody. The other concept I want to introduce to you is bottom up learning. Bottom up learning is a concept where we focus on the body or the somatic symptoms to heal the brain, to heal the trauma. Traditional therapy is top down, meaning that we work through the brain to heal the body. But as you remember, I said Black women oftentimes our symptoms for PTSD, depression, anxiety, or any other mental health disorder, they exacerbate as somatic symptoms. So tension, headaches, stomach aches. Once we heal the body, we can then heal the mind. And then we can then get to some other things. So let's go ahead and dive into some interventions and modalities that are useful for Black women to help rethink mental health for Black women. Next slide, please. All right. Expressive art and art therapies. If you're anything like me, I didn't paint or color. I'm not an artist. Clearly, I'm a social worker. The last time I probably did something art related was in 5th grade, and it was for a grade. In the Black community, maybe you heard, or maybe you heard from somebody at school, art is not going to pay the bills, or maybe you're just super fortunate and you're really creative. But I want to introduce expressive arts and art therapies. You see in the picture here, we have paintbrushes, we have music, we have drama faces. Art is a way that we communicate our experiences, and we have the ability to make our experiences as small or as big as we want. We have the ability to draw attention to what attracts us, even what disturbs us. And the cool thing about expressive and art therapies is that it's not focused so much on the product, like, oh, this looks cute, this looks good, this is a Picasso. It's focused more on the process that the client took to get there. You're focusing on the emotions and the inner working processes that occurred. The other cool thing about expressive arts and art therapies is that people have the opportunity to do it in a group setting, building resilience and cultivating positive relationships. You also have the ability with expressive art and art therapies to witness somebody. What does that mean to witness? That's a really weird term. What does that mean? Witnessing means that you are able to look at something objectively and focus more, like I said, on the process and just listen to someone share. And the other cool thing about expressive art therapy is that when you're witnessing, or maybe you're in that process of creating, it doesn't have to make sense to anybody but the person creating. I don't have to understand it. It's just the way that you communicate. The other interesting thing about expressive and art therapies is that you have the ability to be what we call a third. And a third is not just witnessing, but it's experiencing the art, looking at the art and thinking about the processes or even experiencing the processes and emotions that the actual um, artist went through when they were doing this. And so it's really, I think this would be a really cool thing to introduce into more into research, but also when you're working with Black women. Like I said, some of you all may not be therapists, you may not be in the mental health or medical field. What does art therapy look like? Developing an art practice. Go get a coloring book. Go get paints. Maybe you're into music. I know I'm a music head, so do a lyrical analysis. Maybe something that you can relate to is I'm a millennial. I don't know if you had a MySpace page and you would put your song on your MySpace page, or maybe you was that person that recorded your song on your voicemail and this is how I feel. Or maybe you sent it to, your little boo thing trying to express yourself. Think back to those times. There's a lot of healing in art. And it also expressive and art therapies allow you to access a sense of play as well. Next, we have one of my favorite interventions that I use with a lot of clients that I work with is mindfulness-based cognitive behavioral therapy. What is that? That's a long word for we do mindfulness and we incorporate some cognitive behavioral therapy or CBT into it. And mindfulness-based cognitive behavioral therapy focuses on acceptance of emotions and feelings and rejects the ability, it rejects the thought of like I'm going to criticize myself. Think back to once again some of the characteristics that maybe you listed, or maybe some people that you know, or characteristics that I talked about. Black women, we can be very self-critical of ourselves. Oh, we missed the mark. Oh, we didn't get the job. Oh, we didn't get that promotion. What am I doing wrong? We tend to reflect internally and try to conceptualize why things didn't go the way that we wanted to. It must have been something that we did. But mindfulness-based CBT allows us to take a moment to one, honor ourselves, honor our feelings, acknowledge them. It also allows us to accept them and experience them. One thing Black women sometimes experience through the strong Black woman role is dissociation. We dissociate from our feelings. Remember how I said, we ain't got time to worry about this. We don't have time to worry about that. I just got to push through. Well, mindfulness is able to draw attention to that and accept it and allows you to move through it while adjusting some cognitive processes. So those are the first two interventions. Those are the first two interventions and models that I have introduced into my practice, and it'd be really useful for you to kind of look at too. When we talk about mindfulness-based CBT, that can look like developing a yoga practice or a meditation practice. It can also it's also a modality that is used by clinicians. So if you research a clinician, they'll let you know if they practice that. There are also stress reduction programs that you can access as well. Next slide, please. All right. The last two interventions that I have is nature-based therapy and mind-body interventions. Mind-blowing nature-based therapy. I know if you're someone like me, I don't like to go outside. Glamping is a hotel for me. I don't want to be one with nature. But research has shown that nature-based therapy has such a healing process to it. The ability to connect and become one with the earth. The other interesting thing about nature-based therapy, if you think back to the cultural contributors for Black women's mental health, is religion and spirituality. Well, when you connect one with nature, look what God made. God made the sun. God made this. God made that. It allows for Black women to incorporate their religion and their spirituality in their therapy process. Remember, I said thinking outside the box? Some ways that I suggest to clients to engage in nature. I'm from down south, or maybe you from metropolitan area, sitting on a stoop. I know for me, I know people in my life that sit outside in a rocking chair for hours at a time and just either talk or they just sit in silence. Maybe it's you joining a hiking group. Those are really popular in my area. Or maybe it's you going out into one of those small little the places that you can rent. Maybe that's just not something you're into. Maybe it's just you stepping outside your house on your back porch, or maybe it's just taking a minute to bask in the summer sun or watch a summer sunset. The other interventional model that I want to introduce is mind body interventions. Remember how I said we have bottom up when we talk about healing? So mind body interventions focus on the body. This is where you get your meditations and your yoga, and it's you're able to slow down and really focus on healing the body, which then leads to healing the mind. Remember how I talked about cultural contributors as far as cultural competence? There is a psychotherapy model called Into that is specifically for Black people, that is a mind body intervention. It has themes of togetherness, harmony, and focuses on resilience. So it's a great way to build resilience and lower cortisol levels. So we talked about a couple of interventions and models. Maybe these aren't things, maybe like I said, you're not a clinician, but these are things that you can go and research and look up for yourself. And I kind of gave little tools that you can kind of use for yourself. The last thing before I go to the next slide is that for mind body interventions, there's so many meditations on YouTube that can look like a loving kindness meditation. It can look like you using the Calm app. And you don't necessarily have to access a professional. It's great if you do. I encourage that you do. But these are things that you can kind of do by yourself. The Calm app or other resources can be free to you should you want to access them. So moving forward, next slide. I told you all that I was gonna give you all some self-care practical tips, and I've been kind of adding little gems in there. These are things that I suggest for my clients when I work with them. But before we go into self-care, a couple questions that I want you to think about, and also put in the chat. What does your self-care practice look like, and when did you develop a self-care practice? Because I was grown when I developed mine. I didn't come out the womb like, yeah, let me practice self-care. That was not me. So when did you develop a self-care practice? What is your self-care practice? And one thing I want to be mindful of when we talk about rethinking mental health for Black women, self-care is not selfish, one. Two, self-care isn't always going out with your friends. It's not always hair and nails. Self-care is an intentional act that we have to engage in. Mental health just isn't a trendy topic. It's a part of us. It is a part of our human experience. So we need to be intentional about it. The other thing I want to point out is when you're working with Black women and we talk about self-care, and maybe I'm talking to some Black women tuning in, and it's just to say, I see you. A lot of times we engage in quote unquote self-care, but it's really maintenance because it's a part of our, when we talk about socialization, we talk about cultural trauma, nails, hair, feet. I'm gonna have a nice outfit on. That's just how we were raised. That's how we were socialized. I'm not walking out the house looking crazy. So sometimes the things that we consider self-care, it's really just maintenance, and it's really not giving us time to rejuvenate and really heal our body and heal our mind. So when I go into these next self-care tips, I'm just going to go ahead and let you know they're probably things that you've seen, but we're going to look at them through a different lens. Next slide, please. All right. So I know you see the slide. Take a minute to digest. We have move your body, build community and relationships, practice rest, fueling your body, and then reflective time and practice gratitude. You've probably heard all of these. They've probably been in the magazines, or maybe you haven't heard any at all, right? I'm open to that as well. But we're going to change the way we think about it, and we're going to think about it from a neurobiological lens. I just used a really big word, and you may or may not know what that means. We talk about neuro, that means brain, it means neurons. Those are basically the nerves in our brain, and they help us think and help us move. Me moving my hands, neurons are doing that, right? I'm not consciously doing those on my own. Have something in my brain working for me. Biological, that just means a biology process that's happening inside of us. So when we talk about neurobiology, because this is the lens that we're going to use when we talk about these self-care tips, move your body. There is a hormone that's released called BDNF, not BMF, like the show we watch. It's called brain-derived neurotrophic factor, and this is something that is released in our body that helps increases our neural pathways. So one thing I want you to think about, neurons that fire together wire together. So we have the ability to change our responses to things. Think back to the biological contributor slide that I talked about, how our gene coding can change. Well, our body can absolutely change our gene coding, but there are things that our body also produces to mitigate that. And so one is move your body. Notice I didn't say exercise. Sometimes there's a negative connotation with exercise and it feels like it's a chore or something that we got to do. Move your body, engage in some dance, maybe go take a new Zumba class, or maybe it's going for a walk or a hike. When you engage in moving your body, you are able to release more brain BDNF, brain derived neurotrophic factor, which is increases your mood. If we think when we talk about depression for men, for Black women, a lot of times they don't, it doesn't only show up as somatic symptoms, it can also mean a decrease in sleep. Well, when you move your body, you increase the melatonin levels. We won't need to take the gummies anymore, the melatonin gummies anymore. You just move your body. Your body naturally produces those things. The other thing is when you engage in aerobic exercise, so running, walking, or maybe you're doing like a nice hit workout, it also increases your BDNF and it also helps improve your mood. So these are some things that we can do on our own. A good thing that I like to offer up to my clients is if you have a good album or you have a nice song that you want to listen to, just go outside and walk, or maybe you're dancing around your house and doing it. The other self care tip that we have is build a community and relationships. And I hear so many times from my clients, it's so hard to make friends as adults. I know. I'm an adult. I understand. But it's really hard to build a community and relationship, specifically after COVID, right? It took a while for us to kind of get back into the groove of things. But when we build community and relationships, it actually helps us not only increase our brain derived neurotrophic factor, which decreases cortisol levels, it also helps us release oxytocin, which is the love hormone, right? It also helps us build connections and attachments. It's really healthy to have a community where you're able to build attachments. You're able to relate to people. No, so think like when you're with your friends, or maybe when you are out with your family, you're engaging in these healthy relationships, or you're engaging in these relationships that make you feel good. They fill your cup. Well, yeah, they do fill your cup, but the other thing that they're doing is they're causing you to laugh. I think people may think it's a joke that laughter does heal. Laughter actually has the ability to heal your body. It helps calm down your nervous system. It helps you regulate your emotions. The other thing that comes with building a community and relationships, I'm gonna pose this question to you. When's the last time you did something for the first time? There's novelty in the ability to experience something new with your friends and family. You have the ability to, go out and then venture out. Maybe it's you joining a run club or a hiking club or a wellness platform, or maybe it's a yoga class, or maybe it's just somebody in your local community, a community garden. These are things that we can engage in that help mitigate some of the and decrease some of the cortisol that we experience from code switching and being labeled as the angry Black woman. Maybe we're not getting paid enough, student loans stressing us out. So those are the first two that we have. The next one we have is practice rest. So many times I hear from clients like, I can't just sit down. I gotta be doing something. I gotta be moving my body. Question, is there trauma in that we always gotta be moving our body? I know for me on Saturday mornings, you better be up at 7 o'clock cleaning the house. Like that was something in my household that we did. What happens now as an adult, I'm up at 7 o'clock cleaning the house. And so when we talk about practicing rest, it's not, it is just sleep, right? It is you sleeping and rejuvenating your body in that way, because when you sleep, you not only release brain derived neurotrophic factor, but you also give your body the ability to process whatever information it took in from the day. It allows your body to integrate what it has learned. Even if you're not in school, maybe it's you learning a new bus schedule. Maybe it's you remembering that you got to put gas in your car in the morning. The other thing with practicing rest is it can be intentional. It doesn't always have to say, like, be physical. It can also be mental. Try unplugging from social media. Try using those features on your phone, do not disturb, or for fitness, making sure people aren't receiving calls. Set a time limit on your social media. Those are great ways to practice rest. Next, we have fueling your body. This is really important, right? I want you all to think about, how am I feeling my body? What did I eat today? Is it fueling my body, or is it causing me to be tired? Everybody loves good Chick-fil-A, Chipotle, right? It's great, but sometimes it increases our cortisol level. And when we experience a drop in sugar and then we add these calorie heavy meals or these carbs into our diet, it increases our cortisol levels. The other thing is, what are you eating? I ask my clients all the time when they say they're anxiety depressed. When you eat starch heavy, high sugary foods, or sodium high foods, you tend to experience depression, anxiety at a higher level. So, what are we filling our body with? What are some reasonable things that we can do? Maybe that's something sweet you need after dinner. Maybe it's just some strawberries, or maybe it's just a little piece of chocolate, or maybe it's a peppermint. Maybe it's some fruit, right? Or maybe you're substituting like once a week, I'm gonna have a vegan meal, or I'm going to go pescatarian for 30 days, or maybe you're incorporating some smoothies into your diet. These are things that we can do to fuel our body and increase our BDNF and also improve our mood and improve our mental health. The other thing is when we're filling our body with not the best foods, it can decrease our mood. Like I said, not only the anxiety and depression, but it also doesn't help our IQ, our ability to process. We become more irritable and aggressive when we're not filling our bodies with the best things because it's hard for us to focus. So let's think about what can we do to incorporate this in our day to day. The last one we have is reflective time and practice gratitude. This is probably one of my favorite coping skills to engage in. When you engage in reflective time and you practice gratitude, you give yourself the ability to emotionally regulate, but you also give yourself the ability to reflect and really check in with yourself. Like, am I good? Am I okay? And sometimes it can feel awkward to check in with yourself, but it is something that we should do. What does reflective time look like? Maybe it's you journaling at the end of your day. I always tell my clients, like, what are the roses and the thorns of the day? What went really, really well? Or what's something that didn't go the best? Maybe it's you actually journaling and talking about your feelings in a safe space where you control what is said and what is not. Your journal is not going to tell anybody. If you're wondering, well, how can I practice gratitude and how can I get these journal prompts? Like maybe I'm not engaged with a mental health therapist yet. Well, Amazon and other sites have 5-minute journals that give you prompts. You can go on YouTube and have journal prompts read to you throughout a certain amount of days. I know there are journal apps that you can use on your phone for free. Maybe it's maybe it's a therapist on Instagram that you find and you find a journal prompt. There are so many things that can happen with that. So when we talk about these self-care tips, just want to let you all know that you don't have to incorporate everything in a day or today. Take it step by step. Take it one by one. It can be overwhelming when we tend to do that. Next slide, please. All right. So that kind of wraps up my presentation. I hope you all will take a little couple of gems from that. Some recommendations for research. If you are in a research field, or maybe you do work with Black women, or maybe you just want to learn more about it, some things that I thought would be really important for us to expand our research with Black women and making sure that we're getting the assistance that we need and the culture comes to care that we need is that we look at and we discuss culture competent practices that aid in the assessment and diagnosis and mental health treatment of Black women who have anxiety and depressive disorders. The other thing is let's look at utilizing expressive arts and art therapies with Black women to, what is the effect that those have on the treatment of depression, stress, and anxiety with women, Black women who identify with a strong Black woman role. And then lastly, we definitely need to look at how can we integrate spirituality and religion into mental health and the treatment of Black women, and then use that to encourage them to seek mental health services. I didn't mention this on the one slide, but two things can be true and two things can coexist at the same time. You can believe in God and go to church and still have a mental health practice and take care of yourself mentally. So these are the recommendations for research that I have. Next slide, please. All right. Before we go, I told you I was going to give you some resources. So I jotted down here some resources that could be beneficial for you. If you don't know, there's Therapy for Black Girls. That is a therapist directory. They also have some great meditations on their website. You can filter through what therapist you want to use based on insurance, state, in person, not in person. It's a great resource to have. Then we have the Self Love Organization. This is an amazing organization that is a wellness platform for Black women. Remember when I talked about meditation and healing the body from bottom up interventions? This is a great organization that does so, and it specifically focuses on Black women and girls. Next, we have the Love Limb Foundation. This foundation is amazing. It focuses on supporting Black women and making services accessible through therapy. So you can access that. And then we have the Black Mental Health Alliance. If you're a care provider or a professional, you can access this to get trainings, to learn more culturally competent approaches. Next, we have Black Girl Smile Inc. This is an amazing project that focuses on Black girls' well being and mental health. Next is the Okra Project. This is a great resource that I found. This is for Black transgender women, and they work with supporting Black transgender Black women in the transgender community, providing housing security, financial security, for appointments, as well as access to care. They want to make it accessible. The next, It Takes a Village collaborative. I'll be remiss. This is a Howard alum. This is amazing collaborative that is based in Washington D.C. and they have retreats that are available for you to engage in for mental health services and well-being. And then last but not least, of course, BlackDoctor.org. As you all know, Black women, we oftentimes are professional dot connectors, and we have somebody for everybody. These resources you can also use for assistance for Black men. You also have Therapy for Black Men .org. You also have Beam and other resources that you can utilize, such as Psychology Today, to access services. Next slide, please. All right. So I appreciate you all for tuning in with me today. Here is the evaluation code and link. I would love for you to give feedback, talk about how your experience was, what you learned. It is definitely necessary for us to continue and also give feedback for me to improve. We also want to see how you related and connected with us. So the evaluation link is here. Go ahead and snap a picture if your phone is near. And then last but not least, um, I got to give you all a minute to kind of look at the slides to make sure you get the information. All right, next slide, please. If you wanted to connect, that is my professional Instagram, Grow with J Therapy. I post on there. It's a great way to connect with me. You can also find me on LinkedIn at Jalen Williams. Those are other great ways to connect with me. And I think in the evaluation, it also gives you opportunity to kind of give some feedback as well. I appreciate you all for being here today and listening. I hope you took some gems away that you can apply to your life or maybe help a fellow Black woman out. And I hope you all have a great rest of your day. Thank you for tuning in. Bye.